The unveiling, a mother's decades-long secret. The doorbell chimed, a polite, unassuming sound that shattered the quiet hum of Sarah's Tuesday morning. 60 years old, with kind eyes and hands that always found comfort in knitting, Sarah lived a life of gentle routine in her Aurora, Colorado home. Her son, David, a brilliant architect, was turning 38 next week, and Sarah was deep in planning his favorite chocolate cake, humming a forgotten tune. David, her world, her joy. Her adopted son, raised from infancy, loved fiercely, unconditionally. He was her everything, the reason her life had truly begun. She opened the door, a warm smile ready on her lips. It faltered, then vanished. Standing on her porch was a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, with kind, searching eyes and a nervousness that mirrored her own sudden unease. He looked vaguely familiar, in a way that tickled at the edges of a long-buried memory. A phantom ache she'd thought long gone. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice hesitant, a little uncertain. "Yes," Sarah managed, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. "My name is Mark Johnson." He took a deep breath, and his gaze, unwavering, met hers. I believe you're my biological mother." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The chocolate cake, David's birthday, the peaceful Tuesday morning. All evaporated into a swirling vortex of shock and disbelief. Her mind screamed, "No, impossible." That life was buried deep, forever. She clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white. Mark, 38 years old, just like David. The world tilted on its axis, and Sarah felt the cold breath of a past she'd painstakingly sealed away for decades, now rising, chilling her to the bone. Her quiet life, built on careful omissions and unspoken truths, was about to unravel. Chapter 1. The Echo of a Knock. Sarah stared at the man on her porch, her mind racing, scrambling to reconcile the present with a past she had meticulously, brutally excised from her narrative. Mark. The name felt alien, yet devastatingly familiar, echoing a ghost she had learned to silence. His eyes, a shade of warm brown, held a flicker of a gaze she remembered from another lifetime, a flicker that sent a shiver down her spine. He was 38, the same age as David. The coincidence was a cruel twist of fate, or perhaps a cosmic alignment. I think you have the wrong house," Sarah finally managed, her voice thin, reedy, a desperate, reflexive lie. She wouldn't allow this truth to surface. Not now, not ever. Mark's shoulders slumped slightly, but his gaze remained earnest. "I don't think so, Mrs. Hayes. My adoption records, they led me to you." Sarah Hayes, born 1965, attended Oklahoma State. Gave birth to a son in Denver in the summer of '86. He spoke the facts with a quiet reverence, a stark contrast to the emotional maelstrom raging within Sarah. "I have the full non-identifying information, and a private investigator helped me find the identifying details." Each word was a hammer blow, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of her life. Denver, 1986, the summer she'd spent in a haze of secrecy, shame, and overwhelming fear. The summer that had ended with a hollow ache and a silent promise to herself to never speak of it again. The memories, long dormant, began to stir, like serpents uncoiling in the darkest corners of her mind. I can't," Sarah stammered, backing away, a primal instinct to protect her carefully built world, overriding everything else. "I can't talk about this right now." She began to close the door, a desperate attempt to shut out the past that now stood, corporeal and undeniable, on her doorstep. "Please, Mrs. Hayes." Mark's voice was gentle, pleading. I just want to know. I don't want to disrupt your life. I just want answers. My adoptive parents were wonderful, but I always felt this emptiness, this need to understand where I came from." His sincerity pierced through her panic, a tiny crack in her resolve. She saw not an intruder, but a young man searching, just as she had searched for peace all these years. But the risks, the consequences, David, her son, her beloved David, who knew nothing of this. How could she possibly explain? I need time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, come back tomorrow, at noon. I need to think." She needed to breathe, to compose herself, to find a way to navigate this impossible new reality. Mark nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Tomorrow, noon." He stepped back, a respectful distance, and Sarah, trembling, slowly closed the door, leaning against it as if it were the only thing holding her upright. The house, once a haven of calm, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in on her. The phantom ache in her womb, a memory from a lifetime ago, returned with a vengeance. 38 years. 38 years of silence. 38 years of building a new life, brick by painstaking brick, on the foundations of a buried truth. She paced the living room, her mind a whirlwind of fear, regret, and a terrifying, forbidden curiosity. He looked so much like... No, she wouldn't allow herself to think it. The man who had been the father, a fleeting, passionate encounter from her college days, was a face she had blurred into oblivion, a memory she had consciously suppressed. David's birthday. Next week. The irony was brutal. How could she celebrate David, her wonderful, loving son, knowing this colossal secret now lurked just beyond her front door? What would this do to him, to their bond? He was her rock, her confidant. To know that she had kept such a fundamental part of her past from him felt like a betrayal before the truth was even out. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that the silence was over. The dam had broken. She couldn't send Mark away again, not truly. He was a piece of her, a living, breathing connection to a life she had chosen to forget. But how to integrate him into her carefully constructed present without shattering it entirely? The answer felt impossible, shrouded in the terrifying unknown. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The night was long and sleepless. Sarah tossed and turned, haunted by fragmented memories. The unfamiliar weight of her belly, the whispers of scandal, the cold sterility of the hospital room, the overwhelming, crushing loneliness. Each fragment was a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every recollection. She was 18, fresh out of her small, conservative hometown, bright-eyed and idealistic, starting college in Oklahoma. She met John in her freshman year. He was older, charismatic, studying engineering, with a rebellious streak that both thrilled and terrified her. Their connection was immediate, intense, a whirlwind of stolen moments and passionate promises. She had fallen, hard and fast, convinced he was her soulmate, her forever. Then came the fear, the missed periods, the home pregnancy test, crudely bought and hidden, revealing two stark lines that plunged her world into terrifying chaos. John, surprisingly, was there for her. He was scared too, but vowed to stand by her. "We'll figure this out, Sarah. Together." But his family, powerful and deeply entrenched in their small, conservative community, had other plans. They wanted him to finish his degree, pursue a prestigious career, marry someone suitable. A pregnant co-ed from a different social standing was not suitable. His family had pressured them relentlessly, offering solutions that reeked of shame and secrecy. They had orchestrated her move to Denver, ostensibly for a summer program. But in reality, to hide her burgeoning pregnancy, John had promised to follow, to find her, to make things right. But the letters had stopped coming. The phone calls, clandestine and few, had grown more infrequent, then ceased altogether. She was alone, isolated in a new city, her body betraying her heart aching for a love that had vanished. The memory of giving birth was still raw, a visceral pain that transcended time. The nurses, kind but detached, the paperwork, sterile and final. The agonizing choice: no job, no money, no family support, just the crushing weight of judgment from a society that offered little grace to young, unwed mothers. She had been convinced, truly convinced, that adoption was the only way to give her son a chance at a better life, a life she, a scared, desperate girl, couldn't possibly provide. She had held him, just for a moment, a perfect tiny bundle, and then he was gone, erased. Or so she had tried to make herself believe. The next morning, Sarah knew she couldn't face Mark alone. She needed to anchor herself, to find a witness to that painful past. She remembered Emily Peterson, her roommate during that fateful summer in Denver. Emily, who had seen her despair, who had held her hand, who knew fragments of the truth. Emily, who now lived just a few hours away, in Boulder. With trembling fingers, Sarah found Emily's old number in her rarely used address book. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar, cheerful voice answered. "Em, it's Sarah." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a joyous gasp. "Sarah! My goodness, it's been years. How are you? What a surprise!" I need to see you, Em. It's important. Something big has happened. Something from back then." Sarah's voice cracked. Emily's tone instantly shifted, sensing the urgency, the tremor in Sarah's voice. "Sarah, what is it? Are you okay? I'll be there. Give me an hour. I'm leaving now." An hour later, Emily, her hair now flecked with silver, but her eyes as warm and perceptive as ever, sat across from Sarah at her kitchen table. Sarah, clutching a mug of cold tea, poured out the story of Mark's arrival, the doorbell, the shocking revelation. Emily listened, her expression shifting from surprise to profound understanding, her eyes mirroring the pain that Sarah was finally allowing herself to express. "Oh, Sarah," Emily whispered, reaching across the table to take her hand. "After all these years, I always wondered if he would ever find you. I truly did." "You knew?" Sarah asked, her voice incredulous. "I knew you were pregnant, yes, and that you had to give him up. You barely spoke, but I saw the pain. And the little bit you did tell me, you were heartbroken. You were so young, so scared, so alone. It wasn't fair what they put you through. You made the only choice you thought you had, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." Emily squeezed her hand. "I remember John. He disappeared so suddenly. You were devastated." Sarah swallowed, the memories flooding back, less fragmented now, bolstered by Emily's presence. "He promised to come. He never did. I thought he'd just abandoned me, abandoned us both. He didn't, Emily said quietly, her gaze fixed on a distant point. Not entirely. I remember, after you left, I went back to the dorm. I was packing up my own things, and there was this letter. It had been slipped under our door, probably after you'd gone to the hospital. I picked it up, thinking it was yours, but then I saw it was from John. It was addressed to you, but it must have arrived late. I truly debated whether to open it or send it. But your parents had told the dorm supervisor you'd dropped out for personal reasons and not to forward mail. They were so rigid, and I was scared of getting involved. So I kept it. I never sent it. I never knew how to find you again, and it felt too personal to just put in the mail to your parents' house. I kept it safe, always thinking, one day, if I ever saw you again. Emily rose and walked towards her purse, rummaging inside. She pulled out a small, worn leather wallet, opening it carefully. From a hidden compartment, she extracted a single, folded, yellowed envelope. It was old, the paper thin and fragile, the handwriting faded. "Here," Emily said, her voice soft, laden with years of unspoken regret. "I am so sorry, Sarah. I should have tried harder to get it to you. I was so young, so foolish." Sarah's fingers trembled as she took the letter. It was addressed to her. The handwriting was unmistakably John's. This was it, the missing piece, the truth about the father of her firstborn son, the truth she had suppressed for 38 long years. Chapter 3, John's Unsent Letter. Sarah held John's letter, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The paper felt impossibly thin, yet it held the weight of a lifetime. The postmark was from Oklahoma, dated September 1986, just weeks after she had given birth to Mark in Denver. The words, written in John's familiar, sprawling hand, blurred before her tear-filled eyes. She read it slowly, carefully, each sentence a revelation, a balm, a fresh wound. "My dearest Sarah, I know this letter is late, so late, and I pray it finds you. I pray it finds our son. I am so sorry, so profoundly, terribly sorry for not being there, for not coming to Denver as I promised. My family, they found out. They didn't just pressure me, Sarah. They forced me. They threatened to cut off my tuition, my future, everything. They locked me down, physically, almost. They kept me from getting to you. My father, he's a formidable man. He saw you, us, as a threat to his reputation, to my career path. He even intercepted my calls, my attempts to reach you. I fought them, Sarah. I truly did, but I was trapped. Young, stupid, and controlled by them. And when I finally broke free, truly free, and managed to get to Denver, you were gone. The home told me nothing, just that you'd left. I went to the address where you said you were staying, but it was empty. I felt like my heart had been ripped out. I searched for weeks, months. I tried to find you, to find our son, but there was no trace. It was like you vanished. I never stopped thinking about you, about him. Not a day has gone by when I haven't wondered if he was okay, if you were okay. I've carried this guilt, this regret, this profound sadness for 38 years. I even tried to hire a private investigator years ago. But the adoption records were so locked down, I never found a lead. If you ever get this, if you ever find this, please know that I loved you, Sarah, and I loved our son, even if I only held him for a moment. Please know that I never abandoned you willingly. I was a coward, yes, under their thumb, but I never stopped caring. I never stopped looking. I have tried to build a life, a good life. I finished my degree. I have a family now, a wonderful wife and 2 daughters. But a part of me has always been missing, a void that nothing has ever filled. The memory of you, of him, has haunted me. If you ever find this, please contact me. I live in Denver now, running my own engineering firm. My contact information is below. With endless regret and hope, John Harrison. Sarah crumpled the letter to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Not just tears of sorrow, but of profound relief, of understanding. He hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't. He had been trapped, just as she had been. The decades of silent resentment, the bitterness she hadn't even realized she harbored, began to dissolve, replaced by a deep empathy for the young John, caught in his own gilded cage. He had searched too. He had remembered. He had carried the same wound. Emily sat beside her, rubbing her back gently. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. All these years." "He searched, Em," Sarah whispered, pulling away to look at the letter again. "He searched for us, all this time." The burden, so heavy for so long, had been shared, unbeknownst to her. The next morning, Sarah knew what she had to do. She had promised Mark she would see him at noon, and she had a secret to share with David that would change their lives forever. When Mark arrived, precisely at noon, Sarah was ready. Emily sat beside her, a quiet presence of support. Sarah held the photograph of herself with baby Mark and John's letter. Mark's eyes widened, then filled with tears, as Sarah, her voice steady now, finally told him the truth. The whole, unvarnished story of his birth, his adoption, her despair, and John's desperate, failed attempts to find them. She handed him the letter. Mark read it, his face a kaleidoscope of emotions. Shock, sadness, a dawning wonder. "My father," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "He looked for me. He looked for you." The connection, once a phantom, was now undeniably real. Mark, who had spent his life searching for answers, now held a tangible piece of his history in his hands. "He wants to meet you, Mark," Sarah said, her voice full of a hope she hadn't felt in years. "He never stopped wanting to. And now you can." Chapter 4: The Unraveling for David. The hardest conversation, Sarah knew, was yet to come. David, her beloved David, the son she had raised, cherished, poured her life into. How could she tell him that she had another son, a secret child, a living reminder of a past she'd hidden? The fear of hurting him, of him feeling like a second choice, was almost unbearable. That evening, as David sat across from her at the dinner table, recounting details of a new architectural project, Sarah felt a profound sense of dread mixed with a resolute determination. She had to tell him. The truth, once unleashed, could not be contained, and she would rather he heard it from her, framed by her love, than stumble upon it by accident. "David," she began, her voice a little shaky, "I need to talk to you about something very important. Something from my past." David looked up, sensing the gravity in her tone. His brow furrowed with concern. "Mom, is everything okay?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Yesterday, a man came to the door. His name is Mark. He's my biological son, your half-brother." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum in the comfortable hum of their shared life. David's fork clattered against his plate. His eyes, usually so warm and understanding, narrowed, first in confusion, then in a slow dawning of shock, and finally, a flicker of betrayal. He was rigid, his posture suddenly stiff. "What?" he finally managed, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Sarah explained, her voice low and steady, recounting the story she had just shared with Mark and Emily. The secret pregnancy, the forced adoption, the young love with John, his family's interference, the overwhelming pressure, the despair that led to her agonizing decision. She spoke of the photograph, the wooden box, Emily's revelation, and John's unsent letter. She held nothing back, pouring out 40 years of pain, guilt, and buried grief. David listened, his face a mask of stone. His usual animated expressions were gone, replaced by a profound stillness. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, just absorbed every word, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Sarah, as if watching a terrible play unfold before him. When she finished, the silence returned, heavier this time, suffocating. Sarah waited, her heart in her throat, for the inevitable explosion, the anger, the accusations. Instead, David pushed away from the table, scraping his chair loudly. He walked to the window, his back to her, staring out into the deepening twilight. "You never told me," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but laced with an undeniable tremor of hurt. "All these years, my entire life, you never said a word." "I was so afraid, David," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Afraid of hurting you. Afraid you'd think that you weren't enough, that I loved him more, that you'd feel like the secret. I was afraid you'd resent me for keeping it. I was so ashamed of that part of my life, the choices I made. I wanted to protect you from it, from the pain." He turned, his eyes wide and haunted. "Protect me? Mom, you hid half your life from me. Do you know what this feels like? To suddenly find out you have a brother? A brother who's my age? Who I knew nothing about? It's like our entire past is a lie." "It wasn't a lie, David," Sarah insisted, her voice breaking. "My love for you was never a lie. It was real. It was fierce. You were my second chance, my salvation. I poured every ounce of my being into raising you, into making sure you had a good life. I couldn't bear to revisit that pain. And I couldn't risk losing you." David ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "I don't understand, Mom. Why now? Why did he show up now?" "He searched for me, David," Sarah explained softly. "Just like I searched for him, secretly. Just like John searched for both of us. The truth, it found us. He was standing on our porch yesterday, and I couldn't turn him away again. He deserves to know. And you deserve to know too." He was silent for a long moment, the weight of the revelation settling over him. Then, with a deep sigh, he slumped into a chair opposite her, burying his face in his hands. Sarah watched him, her heart aching, knowing she had caused him profound pain. But she also knew this was necessary. This was the only way forward. Finally, David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "So, I have a brother. My biological mother gave him up, and my adoptive mother kept him a secret for 38 years. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "It's a lot to take in, Mom. A whole lot." "I know, honey," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with profound regret. "I know it is. I pray you can forgive me for keeping it from you." David looked at her, his expression still raw, but the anger in his eyes had begun to soften, replaced by a deep sadness. "I need time, Mom. I need to process this. Everything. Our entire history." He stood up, his movements stiff. "I think I'm going to go for a drive. I need to be alone for a bit." Sarah watched him go, a profound ache in her chest. The silence in the house, now heavier than ever. screamed of secrets unveiled, of shattered trust, and of an uncertain future. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but the truth, finally, was out. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first step towards healing. Chapter 5: The Unseen Thread. The next few days were excruciating. David kept his distance, polite but withdrawn. He answered her texts briefly, avoided eye contact, and spent long hours at his office or out on his own. Sarah felt the gaping chasm between them, a painful testament to the magnitude of her secret. She knew she had to give him space, but the separation was agonizing. She yearned to explain more, to comfort him, to bridge the divide, but she understood that he needed to process this seismic shift in his world in his own way. Meanwhile, Sarah spent hours talking to Mark. He was kind, earnest, and undeniably hers. She saw echoes of herself in his gestures, glimpses of John in his smile. He spoke of his adoptive parents with deep love, but also of the persistent, quiet yearning to know his biological roots. He had found a family that loved him, but a piece of his identity had always been missing. They talked about John. Mark had always known his biological father's first name from his non-identifying information, but nothing more. Now, Sarah shared John's letter, his contact details. Mark's excitement was palpable, tempered by a nervous apprehension. "You think he'll want to meet me? After all this time?" "He's been looking for you, Mark," Sarah assured him, tears in her eyes. "For both of us. He never stopped." Sarah also found solace in long conversations with Emily. Emily, a witness to her youth, helped her revisit the painful choices, not with judgment, but with empathy. "You were a scared kid, Sarah," Emily reiterated. "You did what you thought was best with the information and support you had. And look at David. What a wonderful man he is. Look at Mark, who grew up loved. You made impossible choices, and good came of them. Don't let guilt consume you now." Her words were a balm, helping Sarah to see the past not just as a source of shame, but as a crucible that had forged her strength and her capacity for love. Finally, after 3 days of agonizing silence, David sent Sarah a text. "Can we talk? Coffee tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the Daily Grind." Sarah's heart soared with a fragile hope. Yes, absolutely. The coffee shop was bustling, but their corner booth felt like an island. David looked tired, his eyes still shadowed, but the harshness had softened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in days. "I've been thinking," David began, his voice low and measured, "a lot about what you told me, about Mark, about everything." He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Initially, I was angry and confused. It felt like a betrayal, like you didn't trust me enough to share something so fundamental about your life, like our story wasn't real." Sarah's eyes welled up. "I know, honey, and I am so sorry for that. You have every right to feel that way. But then," David continued, "I started to think about it from your perspective. Being 18, pregnant, alone in the 80s, no support, the societal pressure, the shame. The thought of raising a child without any means, and then having to make that choice, to give him up so he could have a better life. That must have been hell, Mom. Absolute hell." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. "And then," David went on, his voice softening, "I thought about me, my childhood. You never, not once, made me feel anything but completely loved, completely wanted. You were always there. You taught me everything. You were the best mother a son could ever ask for. And knowing what you went through before me, the pain you must have carried, it makes your devotion to me even more profound." He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm. "It doesn't change anything about us, Mom. Not about my love for you, not about how much you mean to me. It adds a new, incredibly complex layer to our story, to your story. And I understand why you kept it secret. I do. It still hurts a bit that you felt you couldn't tell me, but I understand the fear behind it." Relief washed over Sarah, so potent it left her breathless. "Thank you, David. Thank you for understanding, for trying to understand. It's going to take time to fully process, for all of us," David admitted. "But what about Mark and this John? What happens now?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "Mark wants to meet John, and he wants to meet you too. He's excited, but he's also nervous. He's looking for connection, for answers, just like you were, in a way." David was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, a hint of his usual warmth returning to his eyes. "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "Okay, let's meet him, both of them. This is a new chapter, I guess, for all of us." Chapter 6, Circles Completed. The first meeting between Mark and John was arranged carefully, with Sarah acting as a gentle intermediary. It took place in a private room at a small, unassuming restaurant in Denver, close to John's engineering firm. Mark, looking nervous but determined, arrived first. John, older now, his hair mostly gray, but with the same sharp eyes and a deep-seated weariness that mirrored Sarah's own, walked in moments later. The air was thick with unspoken history, with decades of unanswered questions. John's gaze, when it landed on Mark, was one of profound shock and recognition. Mark had his features, his strong jawline, the same earnestness in his eyes. It was undeniable. "Mark," John said, his voice husky with emotion. "You look so much like me." He reached out tentatively, and for a moment, the two men just stared at each other, one a son searching, the other a father who had never forgotten. The conversation that followed was slow, punctuated by long pauses and choked-back tears. John explained his side of the story, confirming everything in the letter: his family's powerful influence, their threats, the forced separation, his desperate, failed attempts to find Sarah and their son. He spoke of his lifelong regret, the constant ache of not knowing. He recounted the day he arrived in Denver, only to find Sarah gone, the home silent, and his heart breaking with the realization that he was too late. Mark listened, his eyes glistening. "I always wondered," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "about you, about why. My adoptive parents were so wonderful, but a part of me always felt unfinished." John then turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow and remorse. "Sarah, I am so sorry for everything, for not being stronger, for not finding you sooner. I never stopped loving you, not in my heart." Sarah, tears flowing freely, nodded. "I know, John. I read your letter. I understand. We were both victims of circumstance and of a time that was unforgiving." The conversation was raw, honest, and deeply cathartic. It wasn't about blame, but about understanding, about the profound sorrow of missed opportunities and the resilience of the human heart. They spoke about Mark's upbringing, his happy childhood, his successful career as a graphic designer. John shared details of his own life, his daughters, their lives. Mark learned he had half-sisters, just as David had learned he had a half-brother. The family tree was suddenly expanding, branching out in unexpected directions. The next day, David, Mark, Sarah, and John met in a quiet park in Aurora. This meeting was different, less intense, more focused on the future. David, having processed much of his initial shock, approached Mark with a tentative smile. "So, you're my brother," he said, a touch of wonder in his voice. "This is wild." Mark grinned, a genuine, open smile. "And you're my brother. Apparently, we've been living in the same city for years." They discovered shared interests, a love for indie rock, a fascination with modern art, a surprisingly similar sense of humor. They talked about architecture, about graphic design, about growing up in Aurora. The awkwardness slowly melted away, replaced by a tentative curiosity and a budding sense of camaraderie. John watched them, a profound peace settling over his face. To see his two sons, now connected, was a moment he dreamed of, but never truly believed would happen. Sarah observed them all, her heart overflowing. David, so open, so accepting. Mark, finally finding the missing piece of his identity. John, finally reunited with the son he had never forgotten. The weight of the secret, the decades of guilt and sorrow, lifted from her shoulders. She felt a profound sense of lightness, a freedom she hadn't experienced in years. The invisible chains of the past had finally been broken. As David's 38th birthday approached, a new plan emerged. Instead of a small family dinner, Sarah suggested a larger gathering. "Let's make it a celebration of new beginnings," she said, her voice filled with a joy that truly reached her eyes. A celebration of family in all its forms. And so, on David's birthday, Sarah's home was filled with laughter and warmth. David's friends, Sarah's closest companions, Emily, John and his daughters, and Mark and his adoptive parents, all gathered. It was a testament to love's expansive power, to the ability of the human heart to forgive, to adapt, and to embrace the unexpected. David stood, glass in hand, addressing the room. "I want to thank my incredible mother, Sarah," he began, his voice clear and resonant, his eyes meeting hers, full of love and understanding. "She taught me what true love and sacrifice mean, and I also want to welcome my brother Mark and his father John to our family. Life throws us curveballs. It brings us unexpected truths. But it also shows us that family isn't just about biology. It's about connection. It's about love. It's about finding each other, even when it takes a lifetime." Sarah watched him, a tear sliding down her cheek. But this time, it was a tear of pure, unadulterated happiness. She looked at Mark, smiling brightly across the room, already deep in conversation with David, their laughter intertwining. She saw John, a quiet contentment on his face as he observed his sons. The path had been long and arduous, filled with sorrow and silence, but it had led here, to this moment of profound peace, of forgiveness, of rediscovered connections. The chocolate cake, now cut into generous slices, tasted sweeter than any she had ever baked. The house, once a vault of secrets, now hummed with the vibrant energy of a family healed, expanded, and forever changed. Sarah, finally free from the burden of her past, knew that the future, in all its complexity, was now truly, beautifully, and unequivocally hers to live. The silent secret had finally spoken, and in its unveiling, had woven new, unbreakable threads into the tapestry of their lives.